Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Releasing Your Inner Dragon with Drake and Marie. I am one of your co-hosts, Maxwell Alexander Drake. I'm an award-winning novelist. I have written in every medium. I teach writing all over the world. As always, my other co-host, Marie, is here.
Hi, my name is Marie Mullaney. I have a YouTube channel where I discuss fantasy world building called Just in Time Worlds, and I also write epic fantasy.
So today we're going to continue to delve into the craft of writing. We've touched on this in different episodes, pieces of it, but we've still getting a lot of requests for this topic. So we're going to be talking about, I don't know exactly what one term to use to discuss this, but we're going to be talking about chapter length and character development and pacing. Like I said, I don't know if we have really a topic that we can call this episode, because we're going to talk about quite a few things.
I think we can call it room to breathe.
Room to breathe. Yeah, you did call it that earlier. Because yeah, that is one of the big issues that people are having. I am going to repeat a story that I told really early on in this podcast, but it falls down that exact same rabbit hole. But before we start, make sure you do all the stuff, you know, the clicking and the checking and the sharing and everything. We've had some massive bumps in viewership here recently, which is really, really nice. But we still need your help. You know, if we're going to get this out there and get this message, if this is helping you because you're listening to it, then obviously it will help someone else. So share this with your writer friends and help us grow this podcast.
Yep.
All right. So I'm gonna throw it to you then, because you did call it room to breathe. Why don't you kind of give a general description of what you think we're going to be talking about today?
This started for me when I stumbled across in my Amazon Prime. I was bouncing through my various streaming services going, there's nothing to watch, you know, as one does, as we used to do with cable and we now do with streaming services. And I was bouncing through Amazon Prime and I saw that they have The Last Ship. Now, I remember watching that in 2014, and then I kind of lost track of it. I think there was a break between seasons or something. And it turns out that Amazon Prime has got all 5 seasons of it, and the show got 5 full seasons. So I was like, okay, well, I remember liking this, so let me restart it and give it a shot. And what struck me, like immediately, was the room the stories were given to breathe. I binged that whole first season in a single night. Literally, I sat for like 14 hours in front of that TV and just watched Last Ship. And one episode just hooked me into the next, hooked me into the next, hooked me into the next, without leaving me on cliffhangers. It wasn't like I was being left on a cheap cliffhanger. The conflict was resolved and the next thing happened. But the opening episode, you know nothing. There's a captain on a ship who's been told, go do 6 months of war games in the Arctic at complete radio silence. Oh, and take this scientist with you. And when the captain says to the scientist, so what are you doing here? She's like, oh, I'm going to go study ducks. And like, oh, you know it's a lie. The captain, everybody knows it's a lie, right? But orders are orders, so off they go to the Arctic. That's it. That's what you know. And then in the Arctic, there's like an attack by Russians, and you're like, what's going on here? And you know what is plotting? And that whole storyline is given room to breathe. Now, fair warning, a pandemic broke out that's like an actual, like full-blown, like 90% of the population dying pandemic. So these sailors don't know it, right? And their emotional reaction to suddenly learning that while they were in the Arctic playing war games and the scientist was hunting this primordial strain of the virus with a attempt to find a cure for it, their families were dying. And that is given such emotional weight for every sailor on that boat. And they don't rush
for the main characters.
Yeah. But I mean, like for obviously you don't meet every one of the 200 sailors on the boat, but like the characters that you've touched, that have all of the, It is given weight. It has gravitas. It is given space to be an emotional shock without crowding it with 10 million other storylines. And it made such a huge difference.
It's been a problem, in my opinion, in the industry forever. You have to get right into it. Audiences are too dumb and ADHD and whatever. You just got to get into it. And some of them are. Both me and you have run into this where we've had readers that are like, wow, you're I don't need all this description. Just tell me how they died and tell me how they overcame that and tell me, like, yeah, that's not good writing. I don't want to tell you, no, the story. I want you to experience the story. Now, that's not for everybody, and we get this. It's not like we're saying those people are wrong. Those people are wrong reading our stuff. Yeah. That's what they're wrong in. They're absolutely right in what they love. Fans are always right. Whatever you love, whatever you're into, whatever your kink is, there's a genre out there for it. And so you should find that and you should read it. Where you're wrong is where you go, I like to read things that are like this, so you should only write things like this. No, you should go find writers who write like that. I'm not going to change for you. But that's one thing. What we're actually talking about is a little bit different because we're talking about allowing time for the characters to do it. So I'll just start off with my my story. And again, I've told this before, but so my very first published book was Farmers and Mercenaries. And the editor who picked it up was a guy named Patrick Labruto. He is a big time editor, or was. I'm pretty sure he's retired now, or semi-retired or whatever. But he was Raymond Feist's first editor. Was the editor for Isaac Asimov and Stephen King and whatever. Actually, his favorite thing is he says that he was the first American editor to reject The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because he said it was stupid and would never sell. So he loves saying that. So obviously he doesn't mind a little self-deprecation. So when he read the manuscript, he was like, boy, I have never seen anybody write violence the way you write. Your fight scenes are off the charts. Like, it's incredible. But it's chapter 4 and it can't be. It needs to be chapter 1. You got to move it. You got to rewrite. You got to, like, this is where this book starts. And I was like, I don't think that's correct. And he's like, kid, you've never been published before. I'm Patrick Labruto. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've worked for every big major house in the entire universe. I know everything. You know nothing. Just do what I tell you to do. And so I was like, all right, you're right. You're right. And so I rewrote. I spent a couple months and I rewrote. I had to rewrite like the first 9 or 10 chapters to get it all that I was at least halfway happy with it. So when I turned it back into him, he was like, so what do you think? I was like, I don't like it. I don't think it works. And he's like, you don't know anything. I'm Patrick Labruto. I know all this stuff. And so he read it and he came back to me about a week later and he was like, all right, I'm going to say something to you that I've never said to a first-time writer ever. And if you ever tell anybody I said this, I'm going to say you're lying. But you were right. This isn't as good. And I don't understand why, because the fight scene is still amazing. And I was like, I don't understand how a man of 30 years experience in the industry doesn't understand why it doesn't work. And it was very obvious to me, which is why I wrote it that way. So the fight scene was this big lion dude. And it's when he's a gladiator in a pit and he's fighting for his life and all this stuff. But when you open with that chapter, you're reading a 7.5 foot tall, 900-pound lion dude killing people. Yeah. Like, of course he's killing people. He's a 900-pound lion dude. Like, yeah, he's not. I mean, he is in mortal danger. And, I don't give anything to my characters. And he does almost die in the scene because they do kind of, it's a buildup. But he's still a 900-pound lion dude. You don't care. His opening chapter, so the 2 chapters in between were other 2 characters, but really it's his second chapter. So his first chapter, which is the opening chapter of the book, is him in a cell. You're in the cell with him. You never leave the cell. No one ever comes and enters the cell. Some people come and talk to him through the door, but that's it. And nothing happens of like action or whatever. But without that chapter, you don't care. that chapter is what makes you go, oh wow, I really like this lion dude. Man, I really hope that he succeeds. I'm really rooting for him. That one little short chapter is what you were just talking about, the room to breathe.
Mm.
To me, it's the chapter that makes the reader give a crap about the lion dude. And so when you actually are then watching him in the fight, you're invested. But the industry is so, and Hollywood is the same way. Like, no, you have to do it. And it can be done right. And I'll say this and then pitch it back to you.
Yeah.
James Bond, they start at the end of the last mission. Now, the last mission is not a film or a movie or whatever, but it lets you see the last climactic moment of them blowing something up or escaping from something or whatever. But it's James Bond. And so you kind of already, man, we're what, 58 films into it now or some crazy thing like that. So you're already invested in it. But yeah, that and that was right to be my career. This is my first published book. So that really solidified my understanding of what my job was as a writer.
So the thing about the James Bond books, and I mean, even in my opening chapter of Sangville Chronicles with Louis, you also start at the end of his mission. And it's also, you're in the action immediately. He's going to be using magic, almost like he's using magic by the second page, and completing his mission. But the story is given room to breathe. And that's the thing to me, is like, there's not like a crowd of other storylines competing for attention. Now, if I compare that with, say, Rings of Power, and I know I pick a little bit on Rings of Power, but it's because I see potential in the show that just was not given room to breathe. There is, like, nobody needed those grim dark hobbits. They did not, nobody asked to have grim dark hobbits. They did not need to be there. And if you'd cut that storyline, you'd have given yourself a lot more space to breathe. Then the problem with the season 1 of Rings of Power is we go from 0 to Mordor in one 10-episode season, as opposed to the really interesting story that we all wanted, which is Sauron as a I forget his name, but as under his disguised name, helping the elves forge the rings, and you're wondering if he's going to get caught. Like, is it going to be a thing? Like, it would have been an intense thriller type thing. But no, they just forged the rings in a single episode. Like, the forging of the rings was the point. They didn't give it enough space. They tried to jam in a storyline for everyone, and in doing so missed all the marks, even though some of those stories, like Elrond's storyline, was beautiful. If it had had room to breathe, it would have had real gravitas. Galadriel, I don't agree with their choice in following Galadriel, but they could have given her storyline more room to breathe and actually established her at the start, instead of going from a kid talking to her brother about rocks to killing trolls in the mountains in one episode. One. It just, nothing was given space.
So I agree with everything you said. Like you brought up Elrond. I mean, the reality is, just from a story standpoint, just a base story standpoint, that is a trope story. We have a kid who's like, I really want to be an engineer, and I'm going to do everything in my power to talk to this best engineer in the world and see if maybe I can. Yeah, he says that in the movie. So they start the trope off exactly the way it is. And then his dad or his friend or whatever is like, oh yeah, no, I've got him right here. I've already told him to hire you, and you're hired. Like, there's no effort. Like, he doesn't have to.
That's what I'm saying. But that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. There is no effort. You know why there's no effort? Because it's done in episode 8, and by episode 9 they have to be forging the rings. It's insane.
Yes.
There's no breathing space. The studios have now created what they call these mini rooms, which is that before the shooting starts, they just beat out the story and write it in isolation. They don't meet the actors. They're not there for read-throughs, nothing. So And it shows. That's
Yes.
why these things read like nobody had edited them,
Yes.
because nobody has edited them.
Yes.
They've been written in isolation, not in conjunction with the rest of the production. Let's talk about like what the people can do to give their stories room to breathe.
Right.
So I think that one of the things we need to talk about in this topic is the importance of, one, giving emotion space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't just drop a bombshell on a character and then move on. Like, give it some processing time, delve into their emotions, have them talk to somebody else about what has happened inside them. Okay, sure, there might be action around them. It might be in the middle of combat or whatever the case is. And yes, that might sweep the whole thing along, but don't then forget about it afterwards. Like, give emotions space to breathe.
So yeah, buildup is very important. Emotional buildup. I mean, we talk about this all the time. Going through Magic Falls, where you'll put out this thing, and we're doing something different. You're writing a first draft, so you're not really, air. But that is one of the things that I do come back a lot, and I'll go, okay, I love where you went to this now, and then I'll start adding the little breadcrumbs to it and ramp it up to get to where your payoff was. Which is what you would have done
in my edit, which is another point that I want to make, is like, your first draft is not going to have that. Your first draft might have emotion in, but it's not going to have the whole ramp up to the climactic moment. That will only come with editing, because once you've gotten there and you're like, okay, these are the emotions I'm building up to, then you can go back and layer it in and really reach the point.
Which is why one of my Drakeisms is brilliance isn't written. Brilliance is edited.
Yeah.
And so, so that's why I bring this up, is because you're doing the first draft. So you're doing these brilliant moments because you're writing in stream of consciousness and all that. And then I'm left braining it and coming through and going, okay, I see where you went here. That's awesome. Now let me back up a few paragraphs and start, or, a few pages or whatever, and start, or sometimes even chapters in the past, and start building to this. So that is something, and I do the same thing. When I'm writing my first draft, it's not there. No one's is. And the point to this is you can't puke words on the page and publish it like so many people do, because you just will miss stuff.
Yeah, so that's absolutely, like, you have to edit up to that point. You have to build up to that editor's point. The other thing that I think is so important with these giving storylines room to breathe is, and this speaks to chapter length. So I get asked sometimes, like, what length is a good chapter? A good chapter is after the conflict of the chapter, not the story, the chapter has been resolved. So here's the big problem with writing chapters that are longer than that. And I've seen this too recently. I've seen people stuff too much into a chapter. Right? So if you've gone up and you've gone to a point of tension and you've resolved the conflict of the story, and everything after that is not in a new chapter, automatically falls flat. Because you've just built me up to this point. I'm like, the story has upped and upped and upped, and I'm now here. And I've gotten the resolution that I'm looking for. And now I'm wanting to turn to the next chapter, but no, the story's still going. So I'm like, okay, but it should be going up, but now it's like fallen into the valley. And it falls completely flat. So if you've built to an emotional high, don't try and...
Well, so one thing to kind of expand upon that, and then I want to go back and talk about two different things if I can remember them. It's one of the reasons why standardized formatting is so important, and why I get so upset with authors who are like, well, I don't like the way that looks, so I'm going to do it my way. No, standardized formatting has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the reader. So the reason why we break that scene, and I like to do it as scenes, because sometimes most of my chapters are one scene long, but really the rules are that we're talking about are for a scene. Most of your chapters are going to be one scene, and that's it. The reason why the standardized formatting is that we now do a scene break or a chapter break is because once I visually see that, I now reset as the reader and I start at the lower point, expecting to go up from here. If I keep going forward, I expect to keep going up, and yet you drop down to this, and now that the monster was dead, they sit around and they have fried chicken. And it's like, what? Wait, no, I'm not reset. You haven't reset me.
Yeah.
And so, that's why the scene breaks, the chapter breaks are so important from a standardized formatting, because it literally is a mental thing that you're doing for your readers. It allows them to go, okay, new chapter, starting over. Oh, look, they're eating fried chicken. Okay, that's cool. They're eating fried chicken, and the dead monster's over there, and we're moving, because
Yep.
it's standardized formatting for a reason. It is a mental thing for the reader. It has nothing to do with you.
I do want to say that if you have hit a really intense emotional high, I would not put, even if I scene break, I would not put a scene with lower emotions after a scene with higher emotions in the same chapter, because even with a scene break, it's going to fall flat. You want to shunt that into the next chapter.
Yeah, and that does get to different rules. When you have multiple scenes in one chapter, you're still overlapping that chapter. It really is the chapter break that I'm talking about. I just hate calling them chapters because of the fact that scenes also have their own rules. But you're right. If you're doing multiple scenes in the same chapter, they still need to be going. It's still one chapter, so it still needs to be going in that direction. It's just the scene break. It doesn't fully reset, but it's like, let's take a sidetrack or whatever, however you want to look at it. So the two things that I want to talk about, first, you said the resolution of the scene. And I just want to make sure, and you're 100% right on that. I just want to clarify that the resolution doesn't mean resolving it. It could be resolved in we didn't resolve this at all because we have this other thing to do, but now we know this. So I just want to clarify that, just in case anybody's like, okay, so every chapter that I write, I have to resolve the conflict and it has to be finished. No, it just has to be resolved to the point that the reader is satisfied that we're at the end of this moment of time. So in other words, we haven't resolved it at all, but we learned we have to go do this other thing or go talk to this other person, there's something else to resolve this actual conflict. But that is the resolution of the scene, is that we've learned what to do to take it to the next step. And then the last thing I want to talk about is, for how long should a chapter be? I teach it, and you've heard me say this on the podcast, every scene has to have 5 things to be a scene. You have to have a setup where you make sure the reader knows who head they're in and where they're at, the location. You have to introduce a conflict. They have to know why we're in this scene. What are we going to be doing in this scene? You have to have a rise in tension toward the end of that scene. You have to have the climax of the scene, and then you have to have a hook. You have to make me want to read the next chapter. And that's how long the chapter should be. It should be 5 points long. Now, if you can do that in 200 words and you're done, then you're done. If you can do it in 2,000 words, 10,000 words, I mean, chapters that are over 10,000 words, you're pushing it for the reader. I do have the occasional chapter that's 7,000, 8,000 words, and I do have chapters that are less than 1,000 words, all in the same project. But I promise you, if you hit those 5 points in every chapter, no reader is going to realize that one chapter was 1,000 words and one chapter was 7,000 words. They're not even going to notice it because they're not consuming words. They're consuming points. And if they consume those 5 points, setup, introduction of conflict, rise in tension, overcome of the conflict, and again, resolution. Again, we already talked about that. It doesn't mean resolving it. And then a hook. They don't know how many words they read. They don't care how many words they read. It doesn't even mean anything to them. It could be 500, it could be 5,000 back to back. You do a 500 word chapter, a 5,000 word chapter, a 500 word chapter, a 5,000 word chapter, and to them, it's going to all feel the same. It's going to feel like it's just one chapter after the next, as long as you hit those 5 things. That's how long a chapter needs to be.
Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is the importance of focus. So in computer science, we have something called the single responsibility principle. Okay, so the classic definition of it by Robert C. Martin is A module should be responsible to one and only one actor.
Yeah, describe it the way you described it to me the other day, because that was perfect.
So a class is a module of code. It's a collection of functions. All right. Every function and every function can do only one thing. So if you think of it in terms of a car, all right, you can have a function that turns the wheels. You can have a function that controls the steering wheel. You can have a function for the brakes. You can have a function that, checks if your seatbelt is tied. But each function does only one thing. Okay, you don't have the brake function also doing the acceleration function. You have one function. And then you have a class that collects those together. And maybe you've got a class called safety features. And all that's in there is things like, is your seatbelt tied? Is this done? Is all of those safety features? Maybe you've got a class called the combustion engine, which controls things like acceleration. You've got a gearbox class, etc. And then all of that together forms the program of the car. But you don't include in that also a control for the trailer you're dragging along behind. Like, that's a separate thing. So and so you focus. And that, I think, is also really, really important, especially in multiple POV stories. Focus on what the story you want to tell is.
So this discussion came up between the two of us because I'm working with somebody who is writing fantasy, and he's new to fantasy, or new-ish to fantasy, because he's from other genres. And I was talking about how poorly executed his backstory was, where he would, like, we're in this moment of time where we're dealing with this event. It's a monster attack. But then there's this paragraph that's talking about how dwarves make mead, because it relates in his mind somehow. And it's like that, and that's when you start talking about the functions and all that. It's like, no, the dwarves make mead and all this. Yes, that's a world building thing. But what has that got to do with the monster attack right now? Like, you're in a monster attack. So that's where you described it as, this is the class, is the monster attack. And so we need everything in here needs to feed that. They need, like you were saying, like, if we have a safety class, then every little function in there is just about safety. It's not about stopping the car or accelerating the car or, whatever. It's about the safety features.
Yeah.
And so that's really where that came from. When you're doing backstory, when you're world building in your story, how you do it organically is you make sure that everything affects that. So as an example, I was writing the other day, and there's a storm going on. And I want to show, part of the world building is that the wife of this main character hand makes rugs. Now, I could just write in there, he loved how his wife handmade rugs or whatever, and just info dump it. But since there's a storm going on, there was this moment where the storm blows the door open and leaves and rain start going in. And so I just wrote something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, but, leaves and rain doused his wife's favorite homemade rug, or, favorite rug that she had handmade, or whatever, however I wrote it. So I'm world building and showing you that the wife is hand making stuff, but in relation to the storm, in what I'm writing about. It's the moment in time. So I'm not info dumping that she hand makes things. It's actually a part of the moment.
Yes.
And so that's for world building, getting it to where we're discussing here about character development. If you're going to be developing a character for, like we were talking about, this whole thing started with The Last Ship. Don't introduce 20 characters and then resolve all 20 of them in that chapter. If you have 20 characters, which is too many, but if you do, you're going to have to take the time to make the reader actually connect to each one of them on an individual basis, so that whatever happens in their resolution matters to the reader. As I always say, there's only one thing real in a story: the reader. Everything else is fake. Everything else is there to impact the reader.
Exactly. And I mean, if I take it back to The Last Ship, in that first episode, we meet Captain Tom Chandler, the scientist, his exo, Percy, the other scientist, and a couple of the crew, but lightly. But
yeah, just as secondary characters.
Yeah, secondary characters in the background. But you know that they don't overwhelm you with too much. The episode is focused on what is going on the ship. The story is intensely told from the ship's limited perspective. And I'm sure that the urge occurred to them to like go for like a bird's eye view of everything that's going on in the world and all of like I'm sure that occurred to somebody in the writer's room. And I'm so glad that whoever it occurred to, their idea was shot down. Because keeping the story so focused on the ship and the viewer is then also cut off from all external, you only know what's going on in the ship. It's amazing. It makes it so intense.
And what really works for that show, because it does get a big cast, but what really works is it really is a simple function. You start off with 3 main characters, 2 or 3 secondary characters, and then all the rest of the crew are really just tertiary characters. You learn their name, you learn their job, and that's it. They're very superficial. Well, after I've spent the time with these 3 main characters, what happens is they slip down to secondary characters in the next story, where one of the secondaries now come up to the front, and we get more of that. Now, what that does is it means that now these secondary characters don't really feel like secondary characters because we know them so much better. So they're stronger secondary characters than the original secondary characters. But now those secondary characters have moved up, or one of them or whatever, and now we're focusing on them. And they do this shifting of position between the characters, moving them up front. But again, what that's done is when your other characters move back, the audience is still connected to them. They don't stop being connected with, oh, well, the captain's now a secondary character in this story. I don't care about him. I don't know anything about him. No, you just literally fell in love with him over the last, 2 episodes, 3 episodes, or whatever. So when he does one thing, when he makes one command or one decision or whatever, and that's his only role in this story, he still feels like the hero because you have already connected with him. And so that's the same thing that I do with my multi POV. That's why I do rotate through the characters the way I do. I create the everyman scenes that I create. Everything is designed to have you take characters up and back and up and back. And so that as I, weave this tapestry of the story, all of them are heroes to you, even though only one actually is at any given time.
In terms of room to breathe, this is why I'm so hesitant about adding a lot of POVs, because I'm like, every POV needs to have room to breathe. You can't have a POV that has 1 or 2 chapters and be like, okay, well, that's a waste. It is a complete waste of words. So you need to give the storylines that matter room to breathe. And here's the other problem. Those one-off POVs where you flit into somebody else's head to do like a whatever a view of the world, or those POVs or those storylines that are like, you introduce a great character, the whole thing is resolved in a chapter and you move on. It's like, the problem with those things is they take up the reader's capacity to care. They take up the reader's interest in the story. You are hitting them with too much. And you're reducing the amount of capacity to care that they have for the rest of your story, the part that's actually important. And that's why you should focus your story and not tell 50 stories. Tell the story.
Another Drakeism. The only person that gives a crap about every one of your characters is you.
Yeah.
And the reader never will.
Exactly.
Don't waste time like, oh, but my bartender's really cool, so I'm going to slip in his head for a chapter because I just really love this character. Yeah, you do. No one else does. They care about the one character or the group of characters that you have connected them to. Screw the bartender. I don't care. I don't want to read him. I don't want to learn him. I don't want to get to know him. He's a stranger. He needs to stay a stranger. Move on. And again, with the realm, I'm pushing the bounds because we have 8 POV characters. and we'll see if it's successful. I think it's going to be, because we do have 20 novels to tell the story. So going with the theme, I put in a lot of room to breathe. It's 4 point whatever million words. So, but again, it's so interesting because, and I don't know if this is going to be successful. We won't know until we start actually dropping these. So into 24 and then through 25 to see what the fan feedback is. But, taking that risk of doing a 25,000 word novella of each character individually and not folding them in. Like, you get 25,000 words of Latimus. You meet him, you go on an adventure with him, you complete the adventure, everything's tied up in a nice little bow. There is a hook, of course, there's always a hook. Then you don't see him again until halfway through book 2. He's the opening story of book 1. Now, because we're releasing them so fast, every 3 months, physically, you don't have a lot of time to wait, but still, you got a lot of words to read. You got 200,000 words to read before you bump into Latimus again, because each individual 8 characters gets an individual story that you get to go on an individual adventure with them, get to know them individually without, again, we're talking about focus. Like, you're very focused, and none of the other characters, nor their parts of the world, nor anything about them is a part of this. And really, the big story hasn't started. So we'll see if it's successful, but that is literally the we're talking about, why would you do this? And that's what I decided to do back in 2019 when we started working on this project. It was definitely in my original designs of how I wanted to tell this story, and never seen anybody do it that way. So we'll see if it's successful. It's always a little nerve-wracking being the first to try something out. But fortune favors the bold.
Fortune favors the bold, indeed. We will see. We will see.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in a novel, it's one thing, right? You have space. But just briefly touching on Rings of Power, you don't have space there. The studios restrict these things to 10 episodes now because they've decided to go over the freaking wall. Like, we all want movie quality special effects, and like, I don't. You can kill the movie quality special effects. Give me some, okayish looking CGI. It's fine, and give me 20 episodes of like some space to breathe. Like, believe me, the special effects are not what I'm watching this for.
It would be really interesting. So when you were talking about that, it took me back to the 1960s, 1970s Doctor Who, which I love. And the special effects are god awful. I mean, just god awful.
They are. They really are god awful.
There is a space monster that you can still see the actor inside of the suit, because the suit is literally just bubble wrap that has been wrapped around him and then lightly spray painted green. Like $10 worth of bubble wrap and 2 cents worth of spray paint. One of my favorites is from the first episode where they introduced the Autons. This is like in the 70s sometimes. Could have been the 80s, but I think it was late 70s. Because that's when this plastic furniture was everywhere. Everybody had the blow-up furniture that now 5-year-olds use in their playrooms. For whatever reason, like, adults would put these in their living room back in the 70s because it was just so awesome. But there was a human that was talking to like the leader of the Autons in his office, and he had messed up, and the leader was going to kill him. And he's like, my Autons are going to rule the world and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, how are you ever doing? He's like, well, you're sitting in one right now and you don't even know it. And the actor reaches up and grabs the back of the plastic chair and goes, ah! And he actually closes himself in the chair as if the chair was eating him. But he literally just grabs it and pulls himself. It's so awesome. Those stories were so well written. I don't care. Like, I don't care. And so
like,
the reason I went down that
I do at least want kind of 2000 level Doctor Who special effects. Right. We do have better tech now.
but that's the interesting thing. That's something I'd love to test out, is really, like, could you get away with just horrible special effects if the storytelling and character development was amazing? And I think you still might be able to. I mean, there'd still be those vocal people that are like, oh, it's just so stupid. Because there's people that say that about Doctor Who. Even back then, they were like, like that chair scene. We didn't have the internet, but people still bitched about it. Um,
So I think, like, if I think of Doctor Who when the reboot came out with David Tennant.
No, Christopher Eccleston was the first.
Christopher Eccleston, then David Tennant.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
yeah, Eccleston just did one season.
Those were solid.
Oh my gosh,
they were so good. And the
Russell
special
T
effects.
Davis. Russell T Davis is everything I want to be when I grow up to be a good writer.
Yeah. I mean, it was really good. And if I think of Stargate, SG-1, 9 seasons. Okay, granted, it fell off a cliff after about season 7. But
actually, I think after season 7 is when it actually finally got good.
Oh, really?
So
I wasn't so fond of it. But
when they
I
brought
really
in the Ori conflict, and Ben Browder had finished with Farscape, Richard Dean Anderson retired, Ben came in and took over. I think that's when the writing really got good, because I think they had learned so much lesson from Stargate Atlantis, which was fantastic from start to finish.
Yes.
The first 6 seasons of Stargate SG-1, in my opinion, were a lot of Freak of the Week. I don't think they had a good grasp of what was the
Gould.
The Gould. I don't think they had a good grasp of, like, they never wrote them as immortals, even though they're supposed to be immortals. They never wrote them as powerful gods, like they did in the movie. In the movie, it was fantastic. I don't think they ever were able to capture that in the TV show. I think they were chumps. They were terrible villains that just were idiots.
So I really enjoyed I really enjoyed all of Stargate. I've watched every single episode. I love it.
Stargate Atlantis was my jam. I
loved Stargate Atlantis. So good.
So well done in every aspect. And you want to talk about giving characters room to breathe, because that turned out to be a huge cast, and they gave time individually with every one having, moving up to the spotlight and then moving back and then moving up.
I even ended up liking fucking McKay. I didn't like McKay at all when we started. I was like, this guy's an ass. By the end of it, I was like, yeah, you're still an ass, but you're a relatable ass.
Yep. Yeah, no, like literally everything about Stargate. And then I was so angry when the studio canceled it over money. And that's literally what it was. The actors came after the 4th season. They were like, all right, we're your number 1 highest rated show, period. Like, there is no show on Sci-Fi that's making more money than us. And you're still paying us the same exact rate as when you hired us. We have not gotten one single raise. Do you think? And that's all they did. They didn't even protest or anything. They were just like, do you think we might get a raise next season? And they went, yeah, no, we're going to cancel the show because of that. Screw you guys. And they literally said, the fans will follow us anywhere, so we don't need you. And that's why Stargate. Well, the fans didn't. Stargate Universe was killed because the fans were so angry, which is a shame, because I also was one of them. I boycotted it. And then I watched it after it was canceled, and I was like, wow, this is really good. I really wish I would have watched this and was, because it really was. Stargate Universe was actually really good too.
I really enjoyed it.
But I refused to watch it when it was on because you guys, but then again, that's when Sci-Fi Channel went insane, and they were like, we don't even need sci-fi shows on the Sci-Fi Channel. We can literally just do an entire cadre of teen angst vampire shows, and we don't need a single sci-fi show at all. And then their fans left them, and they were like, why is no one watching the Sci-Fi Channel? I don't understand.
Because you're not giving us what we want.
Because there's no sci-fi on your channel. Not a single one. Like, there was a 2-year period that there was not one single sci-fi show that they put out. Well, last thing, I still have the letter that CEO wrote, the apology letter. I have it on my computer somewhere because I saved it. It was so brilliant, where he came out and apologized to the fan. It was like, I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, it was stupid. I'm sorry.
Well, so my yes, I agree with you. Stargate SG-1 was a lot of Freak of the Week at the start. But at the time, many shows were Freak of the Week. Like Smallville was Freak of the Week. It was very popular. It was a very popular format.
Yeah.
And what I liked about Stargate, about SG-1, is how different the characters were,
Mhm.
how much they interact. Like they really played well off each other. You know, Carter and the what's his name? Daniel and Tilk and Richard Dean Anderson's character, whose name escapes me right now, and it really shouldn't because he was in the movie and everything else, and it's just
Well, Richard Dean Anderson wasn't in the movie. That was
no, I
Kurt
know,
Russell.
no, it was Kurt Russell. It was
Yeah.
Kurt Russell. I actually saw such an interesting interview where they were like, "Your dude isn't quite the same as Kurt Russell." He's like, "Yeah, I watched the movie, and then I realized that I couldn't maintain such a dour character for season upon season. Like Kurt Russell could do it for a movie, but we're talking about years of work here. I needed this boy to have come to terms with the death of his son."
Yeah. Yeah. The only bad thing about SG1 is it actually killed the movie franchise.
Yeah.
They had at least 2 more movies platted out, if not 3. And I really would have, I think that I would have rather have had those than SG1.
No,
Although,
because without SG1, you don't have Atlantis.
right, that's what I was going to say. Although Atlantis is still one of my favorite all-time sci-fi shows of all time.
Yeah.
So that would have been really hard
My
to lose.
point is there, those shows were not stupid loaded with special effects.
No.
They had the space battles were mostly like purely game generated.
Yep.
They had the one singular way of the travel through the Stargate, and then it was just different planets that were pretty much Earth.
Well, it's the same thing with Straczynski and B5, Babylon 5. I mean, special effects on that were terrible. But Straczynski is an amazing, 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 amazing writer. And so, like,
I loved that show.
yeah,
It was so good. Such a great show.
there's a new movie coming out.
I know. I'm hoping.
It's an animated movie. He just announced it on Twitter. Straczynski
Yeah.
is one of the few people that I follow.
So I absolutely like. I loved Babylon 5, and again, its special effects were trash, right?
Mhm.
But it had 20 episodes per season, 20 to 22 episodes per season, and it had room to breathe.
Mhm.
These 1 hour long movies that they're shooting now, it does not have room. I mean, even my complaints about season 8 of Game of Thrones is there is no room. There is no room to breathe. Everything goes too fast.
Well, when you're spending $90 million on a 1 hour episode, it's like, what?
And where's that money going? Because it ain't going to
I mean,
the
I
writers.
remember, and I wasn't even, I mean, we're talking about, I was teens, late teens. Yeah, I had to have been 15, 16. I have to look at the date. Maybe 14 when Next Gen came out, Star Trek Next Generation. I remember the hubbub of them going, it costs us $1 million an episode. And I mean, that was huge. That was like double the budget of anything even near it. It was an insane budget. It wasn't just that, oh, well, last year was 900,000 and now we're at $1 million. No. Like everybody else was at 2, 3, 400,000 episode. We're at $1 million. And like, it was crazy. But, Next Gen is still one of my favorite. First season's the freak of the weekend's a little rough, but by the time they hit that second season, man, everything just that. And then they rolled into DS9. And again, giving all the time to develop these characters and connect them to the readers. And we preach that constantly on this. You have to connect your characters to your readers, and which means you have to take the time to build that up.
When you're writing, it is important to think about how much room you are giving your characters and your plot line to breathe. Don't rush. Don't try and jam it in. Don't try and put in extra details that don't need, extra storylines that don't need to be there.
So really what it boils down to is, and I meant to say this earlier, but we'll close here. It's about picking the scenes. So when you listen to me and Marie plot, and of course it's changed dramatically, and we haven't had time because we've really kind of rushed this to get it out for Comic-Con. It's turned out great. Somehow we've been able to actually get it done. But even when you were listening to the plotting, it was still about what scene is going to deliver this thing that's needed for the story. So it was figuring out what the story needs first, and then figuring out what scene is going to deliver that thing, and give it the most impact. So, why do we start with Laron in his house doing something dinky for his dad? Because we need to build that relationship. Why do we start with Burry just trying to not burn some cupcakes that she's making and show how much in debt she actually is in? Why didn't we start with her sister being, and start with her in the room, the hospital room with her sister? All of those decisions are about, this is how the character is going to grow toward the reader. And so we develop these scenes to make sure that there's this pathway for them to learn the world, learn the characters, learn the conflict, and do it organically so they're actually invested in this story. And so I think that's really what it comes down to. It's not necessarily don't shove everything in. Be very specific in why the scenes, I talked about the Lion Man chapter. Why does the first chapter him in a cell? Because then there's no distractions. It's you and him and nothing else. And you get, there is an event that happens, and this magical thing happens, and you kind of flow through his past life in these things, these little vignettes. All of that is important because that entire chapter is there to make you give a crap about that one character. Why does our Darius chapter start with him going down to breakfast? Because it's required. Like, that's, so you want to look for those scenes. I mean, that's really what you're doing. It's about scene decision making over everything else. The last ship, why did they focus on, and I guarantee you're right, someone in the writers room may have done that, but the showrunner, I guarantee he knew from scratch the first episode we're going to completely not even tell the audience that there's a pandemic going on. We're literally, that's going to be a shocker. We're going to be just here, and we're going to be in this isolated bubble, and this is their world. Why? Because that makes us focus on these characters, and it makes us focus on, developing that relationship. That is good storytelling. That is good scene decision making. And so, yeah.
Don't throw in additional plot lines that do not serve the story.
And also know you have time.
Yeah.
Like let's say you are like hell-bent on this story arc for a secondary character. Great. Introduce the main character first. Introduce all of that stuff for him or her. Make sure all that's done. And then 4, 5, 10 chapters in, you can now move that secondary character up, still keep him secondary, but I'm saying if you really want something about their story, you have time to bring that in later. So it was the same thing with the Realm. One of the authors wrote a line. There was a lightning blast that happened, and he wrote the line of, the character went, "Wow, even elven magic isn't that strong." And I was like, okay, and this was really early on in the project, but I was like, okay, so we haven't introduced elven magic. I get that you, the author, knows about, elven magic, but there's never been a story with elven magic yet. So you can't use this line because it means nothing to the reader. And so it's you have to think about that. You have to think about the development of your story and when you put things in and when and how you can do it. I mean, I know why he wrote it. He wrote it because he wanted to tie in elven magic. But that's not, you can't do it there.
And don't overstuff I would probably have let that line slide just because, like, it's okay as a reference, but don't overstuff your chapters either. The chapter is done when you have resolved the conflict and set the hook.
Right.
Whatever the resolution of the conflict is, once you've resolved it and you've set the hook, it's done.
Yep.
Move on.
Next chapter.
Do not linger.
Yeah.
The last thing, remember, there's a single responsibility principle at play. It has a single job, one job. Let it do its one job, not its 50 million jobs.
You got one job, and you messed that up.
Exactly. Exactly. Don't spread it so thin that all of them fail.
Focus.
And I think that is a great place to end this episode.
Yes.
We will see you soon for another one.
Bye.